Another blood-red sunset and yet another moon face, and still another 100 miles to my next resting place. Driving down the road, eyes on the horizon. Within my car, I'm all alone, but feeling good and feeling strong, knowing that this path I'm on brings me to myself. I'm driving.
Hey now all, I'm Joey C. Welcome back to another episode of Spirit Sherpa. This is the show that helps and encourages you on your journey to unlock your magic mojo. With me, as always, is the Spirit Doctor, Kelle Sparta. Hey, Kelle.
Hey, Joey.
What's going on?
We have a new guest today.
We do. And so we're coming off, and again, don't like to tie things together too much. We want to keep it evergreen, but we're coming off talking about the apocalypse.
Yeah.
And now you're bringing us back. We're going to be talking about some cool stuff today that sort of ties into that apocalypse and transformation and death and all of that.
Kind of. Yeah.
Who do we got today?
So we have Piotr Bienkowski. Piotr's written a book called Where Airy Voices Lead. And so we're going to have a different conversation today than we usually have. It's not going to be an entirely spiritual bent. Okay. We're going to be talking about the history and mythology of immortality as it exists throughout history, right? So if you ever wanted to be immortal or you ever wondered what it was like, this would be the time to listen in. Because Piotr is going to talk to us about exactly how that works. And so, but before we get into the conversation, I just want to invite you, Piotr, to tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to write this book. What inspired you to write the book, and what you're looking to share with people as they read it.
Well, first of all, thanks very much, Kelle and Joey, for having me on the show. It's a real privilege. So my background is as an archaeologist and a museum curator. So I've directed museums. I've been a professor of archaeology. I've excavated and I continue to excavate sites in the Middle East, especially Jordan. A lot of archaeology, it seems to me, and a lot of museum curating is about curating immortality. You know, I curated a very large ancient Egyptian collection for about 20 years in a museum in England. And you can't curate an Egyptian collection without thinking about immortality. A lot of the stuff that's in museums around the world has come especially from the tombs of ancient Egyptians. And that stuff was made specifically to guarantee immortality for the owner or for the dead owner. So it was in ancient Egypt, it was a belt and braces job to make sure that you got to the afterlife. You know, if method A didn't work, then method B would work. If method B didn't work, then method C would work. There were all sorts of fallbacks and fail-safes. So, I mean, in a sense, if you do archaeology, if you work in museums, especially with Egyptian material, you do end up thinking about immortality. And of course, a lot of the the oldest myths, stories, and legends are all about immortality. So it's something I've been interested in for a long time. I was brought up as a Roman Catholic with its sort of promise of eternal life in heaven. So I was thinking about immortality myself personally from a very, very young age. And even as a young boy, I worried about what living forever and ever really would be like. And it actually scared me a bit because I simply could not imagine. And I used to literally get the shivers worrying about it. So, you know, this book brings a lot of things together, both personal fears from early childhood and also my professional work. And in my professional work, I've come across a lot of different traditions and cultures, and that's one of the things I'm trying to bring out in this book. You know, this isn't just an exploration, for instance, of a Christian heaven or, you know, resurrection or the immortal soul. There are different cultures who approach things in different ways. There are Western traditions, there are Eastern traditions, there are the animist traditions, for instance, of Native Americans or Australian Aborigines or New Zealand Maori, and I've tried to weave those stories into the book as well.
Well, that sounds fascinating. And I have to tell you, as you're sitting here talking about the Egyptians and archaeology, I'm going, that's why I wanted to be an archaeologist. Actually, I wanted to be a paleontologist when I was like in 7th grade. And then I found out I didn't have the patience. I was like,
yes, you need a lot of patience. I'm not a paleontologist, but I've managed paleontologists in museums, and they're pretty patient people.
yeah. I went out on my first dig and was like, just carve it out, it'll be fine. No, not good. So, but no, the cross-cultural, the cross-tradition concept of immortality is fascinating to me. How does it appear in the different types of traditions that you reference, the Western, the Eastern, the animist?
I suppose you can look at it in terms of thinking about what are the different ways to achieve immortality. So there's resurrection, you die and you are reborn. Then there's also the question, well, if you are reborn, where are you reborn? What sort of heaven is this, or what sort of hell is this? And there are even in cultures which have an understanding of resurrection, there are so many different depictions or understandings of heaven and hell, which I've tried to bring out at least a little bit in the book. Then, of course, there's the idea of the immortal soul, that whether that's combined with a resurrected physical body, or whether it's something separate, and exactly what that soul is. Is it a pre-existing soul that's always existed, or is it only created for each individual but continues to be immortal? Again, in some sort of afterlife or some sort of post-mortem existence. Then there's the ideas of reincarnation. So this is best known, of course, from the Eastern religions, but it was very important in ancient Greece and Rome as well. There's elements of it in Native American culture as well in America. And again, it's not a simple description of what reincarnation is. It's not just, well, you die and you are reborn in another body. A lot of, especially the Eastern cultures, feel that reincarnation is simply a process. It's a process of spiritual learning. And eventually you cast adrift the ties of the physical body and unite either in the oneness of the universe or in some sort of nothingness, which is the Buddhist nirvana. Whereas other reincarnation traditions are simply interested in life after life after life. Then the animist traditions talk about different sort of transformations, whether into different humans or into animals, plants or spirits, trees, parts of the environment. That's a very important part of, for instance, Australian Aboriginal spirituality, but it is a form of immortality. Then, of course, there's all the attempts to prolong our lives on this earth. In contemporary times, we still have that through the existence of cryonics institutes, where people can sign up, usually pay quite a lot of money, to have themselves deep frozen soon after death, with the hope that sometime in the future, technologies will be available that will either cure what killed them or will extend their lives indefinitely. In ancient times, exactly the same idea of trying to extend your life indefinitely happens with the very oldest story in the world, that of Gilgamesh in ancient Mesopotamia. It's first known in its earliest form in the late 3rd millennium BCE, but that is a story of a man who goes in search of immortality, just like the people today in the cryonics institutes. So all those are ways of, should we call it, trying to achieve real immortality. So it's a way where you actually will somehow survive, whether on this earth or in some sort of afterlife, or as maybe as part of your community, as part of a plant, an animal, or part of the landscape. In a lot of cultures, though, the discussions, the myths, the stories about immortality have been an acceptance that real immortality is in fact unachievable. And you have a sort of symbolic or proxy immortality. And that can be achieved through fame, through your great deeds, or through your importance as a king or a warrior. Or, of course, through children. And even in the story of Gilgamesh, again, going back to the very first story, he tries to achieve real immortality on this earth. But the moral of the story, the way it ends, is that he fails to achieve it. And what he learns is that the only immortality available to him will be through the fame of his achievements and through his progeny, the children.
So I imagine that if you're talking immortality, that you also have to talk death, because they're entwined, right?
Completely. I mean, it's a truism to say that without death, there would be no immortality. But a lot of philosophers, psychologists, and sociologists today believe that death actually is the fear of death, or the existence of death, is what creates culture. That without having that end point, there would be no point for us to do anything. And again, this has been explored. In fact, it's been explored for thousands of years through stories and myths. These days, philosophers and sociologists talk about it as a way of trying to explain culture to us, and trying to explain that, in fact, it is all of culture is our bid to be immortal, because we know we are going to die. Therefore, anything we do, and especially if it's something that's going to be an achievement that somehow outlives us. So whether it's having children, or whether it's being somebody very important who have statues put up to you, or whether you write a book, or whether it's something more mundane. You're a supporter of a football club that precedes you, and you support it, but you know it will outlive you. It's something important that will outlive you. So there's a lot of discussion that the existence of death is what creates culture, and culture is actually a bid for immortality. Going back to my archaeological roots, I'm not sure I completely buy that argument, but it's one of these things that can be a great dinner time conversation, because there's no right answer. Why do we do the things we do? What is culture? I think there are so many different explanations for what happens in cultures, that trying to find, the one explanation of, this is why we create culture, I don't think that's necessarily the right way to go. But it's, interesting to speculate.
Well, and, there's other mythologies that exist in the world that are referencing immortality. I mean, the vampire mythology being the most obvious one, right? And if you think about it, your perspective on it as a child is really right on the money. It's like, if you live forever, what's the point of worrying about doing anything in the now, right? Because you're guaranteed a million billion tomorrows, and so at some point you just lose the flavor for life, right?
And a lot of the stories over the centuries about people who have been immortal. Now, obviously, this is fiction. So this is sure. Speculation. Absolutely. By the writers. Yeah. As far as I know, we have no case studies but written by people who have lived forever, and therefore giving us their experiences. But a lot of the stories are precisely about that people living for a long time, hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, and what's that like, and what happens to them, and is it worthwhile? And in a lot of them, going back to ancient Greek times, right up to, more or less the present day, possibly you can interweave the vampire stories into this. The conclusion is that that it's actually a bit of a curse. It's certainly not a blessing to have this gift of immortality, that it could become tedious, that you run out of things you do to do. And it's some of the stories, if the immortal person has an opportunity to end that immortality. For instance, after X hundred years, they have to take another drink of the particular special
of youth or
elixir
whatever,
or whatever. Exactly. Yeah. Almost always, the punchline is they choose not to,
right?
Because they've had enough. So, you know, in some ways we might think, oh, it would be nice to be immortal. But if you really think about, well, what does that mean in practice, which a lot of people have explored, then, you know, it might not be so great after all. You might, you know, wish you hadn't thought of it in the first place.
Yeah, well, and today's day and age with the pandemic and the civil unrest and all of the stuff going on right now, highlights the fact that, you know, the questionable tomorrow, you know, whether or not there will be a tomorrow, it brings everything else into stark relief, right?
It does, and another aspect of this is the relationship between immortality and youth, or between immortality and aging. And again, this is one of the oldest stories. So certainly one of the great immortality stories dates back to the 7th century BCE in ancient Greece, and is that of Tithonus. So he is immortal, and he is loved by the goddess of the dawn, and she asks Zeus to make him immortal. But she forgets to ask Zeus for eternal youth. So while she stays young and beautiful and fresh because she's an immortal goddess, he ages. And in the end, I mean, essentially, he gets dementia, and she locks him in a room, and she describes him as babbling endlessly. And that theme of not having youth to go with immortality is something that's repeated over the centuries. And in some ways, I think it's very relevant now as we look at life expectancy increasing, this whole, you know, well-being agenda, where people are living longer, but they are still getting dementia.
Right.
And in a sense, you know, what's happening is what happened to Tithonus in the ancient Greek story. So unless you have perfect health, unless you have that eternal youth, would it be worth having immortality?
Right. Well, and, you know, a lot of the drive to be immortal is about the fear of what happens when we die, right?
Yes.
And so, you know, especially within the Christian construct of heaven and hell, right? So what would you say about heaven and hell and how they play out in, you know, knowing that heaven and hell are sort of, you know, they're based in the Christian mythos, and that across other religions and cultures, it doesn't really translate exactly. But, you know, having studied Egyptian mythology, you're familiar, I'm sure, with Anubis and the underworld. And
we'll talk about the Christian heaven and hell in a second, but I mean, first of all, I will actually take issue with you that it doesn't necessarily translate to other religions and spiritualities, because actually it does. And,
Tell me how.
Even obviously within the monotheistic religions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, you have actually very similar constructs of heaven and hell, or at least you have a similar history of debates.
Right.
They all started in the same place. They all had exactly the same discussions about resurrection, about the immortal soul. Do they does the body and the soul unite? What sort of heaven is it? What sort of hell? You know, is this about judgment? Is it about punishment? And very often they had very similar iconography to depict those things. But for instance, other cultures borrowed either from them or, in fact, from their Greek antecedents, because a lot of the aspects of heaven and hell in Christianity were, in fact, borrowed from ancient Greece. They're not peculiar to Christianity, and other cultures. For instance, the Celts borrowed concepts of heaven and hell from. Especially from Christianity and from ancient Greece. The whole Celtic otherworld has a lot of similarities to it as well, and some of the Scandinavian religions also have ideas of a heaven and a hell, which may be slightly different from that in Christianity, but they're still places where gods reside and where humans can aspire to go to, and also there are places of punishment where they can go if they haven't behaved in certain ways that are deemed good by the established religion. So I think there are a lot of whereas I agree with you that there are a lot of religions and spiritualities which don't have that concept of heaven and hell. Actually, there are others besides Christianity historically that do. But I mean, going back then to your question about Christianity and heaven and hell, there are so many different imaginings of what a Christian heaven would be like that, people sometimes ask, would heaven be boring? Even Christians, would heaven be boring? And you can't answer the question, because part of it is, well, what heaven are you talking about? Within the history of Christianity, over the last 2,000 years, there have been so many depictions of heaven. I mean, is it heavenly Jerusalem? Is it a garden paradise? Is it a place where angels sing praises to God for all eternity? Or is it a rather more modern one? Even a Christian one, where we meet our loved ones and we remember everything about our past and their past? Or is it a more medieval place with judgment and punishment, where there are hierarchies of people who are good or less good, grades of reward, where our bodies are perfected and purified? Or is it a mix of these? And a lot of the differences in those depictions of even a Christian heaven come from changes in the cultures that were the Christian cultures over the ages that were thinking about them. So some of it is to do with different understandings of the cosmos. So the original depiction of heaven was a very simplified one, when the understanding of the cosmos was that there was earth for humans, there was a heaven where gods resided, and there was an underworld where the dead went. Once early astronomy realized that in fact the earth was spherical and there were other planetary bodies around, so from the 6th century BCE or so, the understanding of what heaven was and where it might be changed completely. All of a sudden, it wasn't somewhere at the ends of the earth or in the bowels of the earth. All of a sudden, heaven came to be somewhere beyond the existing planetary bodies. And a further development of that argument within Christianity and within Judaism, within Islam, was there wasn't just one heaven, because there were several planetary bodies. These were possibly seen as different levels of heaven. So you've heard the phrase "to be in seventh heaven." The likely origin of that was that in early Christianity and Judaism and Islam, it was understood there were several heavens. The seventh heaven was where God resided. So that was the utmost pinnacle of achievement, the utmost bliss, to be able to face or see the face of God for all eternity. Having said that, there are other traditions which say that maybe there were 3 heavens or 5 heavens, or in some Jewish traditions, there are 955 heavens and not just 7. So
I remember a quote from Christ about there being as many houses in heaven as there are people, or I'm badly paraphrasing, but
yes, and actually the whole idea that there are houses or temples or palaces in heaven is, again, you have to think about where did that come from, and it's partly because in the earliest traditions, heaven was seen as the counterpart to the temple in Jerusalem, especially in Judaism, and therefore the temple was the house of God on earth, and therefore heaven was depicted in the same way as the house of God. And so the early descriptions of heaven very much parallel the temples in ancient Palestine look like, because that's what they regarded the house of God.
So there's a belief that is running through the spiritual community these days, that each person creates their own heaven or hell in the afterlife. How is that supported or refuted in historic references?
Well, in some ways, because you've got so many different descriptions of heavens, and it has to be said of hell. You could say, well, maybe there's something in that, but I think as a historian, my problem with that is that there, within particular periods, there are patterns of what sort of heavens and hells you see, and if you delve into it, you can see where the ideas came from. So, for instance, in medieval Christianity, and I've touched on this already, there was a lot of stress on judgment and on purity. So sex, for example, was a big hang-up for medieval Christians. And so it was the sexually pure, the ascetics, who occupied the highest places in heaven, the highest grades of heaven. And if you weren't sexually pure, if you weren't a virgin, that you could never attain some of those highest places. And the utmost bliss was the so-called beatific vision, to see the face of God for all eternity. For a medieval Christian, that was what you were striving for. Well, certainly by the 18th century, it was a lot of Christians were thinking, well, that actually doesn't sound terribly exciting to hundreds, thousands, millions of years looking at the face of God. And around that time, there was a lot of stress on the soul as the locus of personal identity and personal development. People started to be much more interested in things like psychology and philosophy and the individual and the importance of the individual as opposed to the group. And at that time, different pictures of heaven started coming through, which have continued to be very important today. So the idea that heaven is a place almost exactly like the life we live on earth today, and it's a place where you are reunited with your loved ones, you have family, you have friends, your pets are there, you have hobbies, you have a job, and you have a structure of life that is very similar now. And there's opportunity for personal development. So it's not just staring at the face of God and a static experience. The 18th century and later heaven mirrored this idea that people wanted something more. It was about the individual. And so you get this heaven of personal relationships and personal development where things actually happen. It's a heaven of progress. So a lot of the pictures of heaven you've had since the 18th century have been much more individualized, much more personal. As you say, people create their own heaven, but that's a fairly recent phenomenon. If you go back before the 18th century, and especially to medieval times, especially within Christianity, there was a pretty rigid understanding of what this was and what you had to do and what you would expect. So one of the things I cover in my book, in the chapter on heaven and hell, I look at it through the prism of journeys to heaven and hell. A lot of religions, including and perhaps especially Christianity, had this tradition of journeys to hell, to heaven and hell, which in some ways were a bit like modern near-death experiences. And so somebody goes on a journey to the afterlife and they come back and they tell everybody else what it is they have seen. But these were ways that the early and medieval religions or Christianity tried to explain how a Christian should behave, what their moral behavior should be like, that if they didn't do A, B, and C, then this is what they would expect. So it was a pretty rigid framework for what heaven was and for what you would expect. And once a separate hell was invented, because sometimes in some of the early depictions of heaven, parts of your journey are actually what later became a separate hell. So you have the punishment, almost like a sort of purgatory, in some of the stages of heaven, which you can then get beyond. But afterwards, it became a separate place, and that it was pretty unpleasant. And a lot of the, in fact, virtually all of the medieval descriptions of hell enjoy putting in all the horrendous punishments that will happen to sinners, and they grade the sins. So there were particular punishments appropriate to particular sins. And what's quite interesting in the more modern, post-18th century depictions of the afterlife, there's much, much less stress on hell. There's much less stress on punishment and judgment. Although, I've been looking at some statistics, and what's interesting is that many people today actually do believe in an eternal heaven and hell. So I've got some statistics here that 72% of US adults apparently believe in heaven, but only 58% in hell. And those are of people of all affiliations. Those figures rise if you have a religious affiliation. I mean, an astonishing 82% of US adults believe in heaven. US adults with a religious affiliation believe in heaven. And I'm sure you're right that quite a lot of them will have this post-18th century view that this is something that's a recreation of life. It's something where you remember everything, you have your loved ones around you, and you can have a fulfilled life. That is not the medieval view of a Christian heaven. So
we just did an episode around the apocalypse, and one of the things in Revelations and the Judgment Day and the dead rising, and that's kind of an immortality thing, right? That's
completely, yes.
So, can you sort of give some insight from a historical perspective of the story of Revelations, and just to sort of tie the two episodes together here, on how Revelations work? Because Joey asked me a question when we were done talking about the indicators, and he's like, "So what are you supposed to do if you're in the middle of the apocalypse?" and what comes next, right? And so, from an immortality perspective, from a historical perspective, what does the post-apocalyptic world look like based on mythology and across not just Christian but all cultural constructs there?
That whole idea of the book of Revelation is built around understanding of the end of the world and possible resurrection. That was something that came out originally of a change in Jewish thinking in around the 3rd or 2nd centuries BCE. So, to take a historical perspective, up till that point, Jewish understanding of death and the afterlife was very similar to that in ancient Greece and in ancient Mesopotamia. And it went back to that simplified cosmos that I mentioned earlier, that there was an earth on which humans lived, that there was a heaven where God resided that was inaccessible to humans, and there was an underworld where it wasn't immortality, but it was some sort of bleak continued existence. And the ancient Mesopotamians and the ancient Greeks, and actually the ancient Jews, the Jews of the Old Testament, they believed in actually much the same sort of underworld. In Hebrew, it's called Sheol, and it's in the Greek translations of the Old Testament, that's the word that's translated as Hades, which is the Greek underworld. But by the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, the Jews in Palestine were being persecuted by the ruling powers, who are the successors of Alexander the Great, and the way historians sort of reconstruct what happened is that it's at that point you get the original stimulus for having a heaven that you can actually go to as an individual, as a person in the afterlife, or maybe a hell if you've been somehow Wiccan, because there needed to be a system for afterlife rewards and punishments. The old cosmos, the cosmos of Hades and Sheol, was everybody went to the underworld, irrespective of achievement or non-achievement or good or bad behavior. Well, if you're a persecuted Jewish sect and you feel that your God, you are the chosen people of God, how's that going to work? How come everybody, you and your persecutor, ends up in exactly the same place? And so it's exactly at that point, when they're being persecuted, that the idea of a separate place where you can go to if you're the chosen people, if you've been behaving in a particularly good way, and that was developed later by Christianity and into the separate understandings of heaven and hell. So at first, within Judaism, it was believed that it was only a particular group that would go to heaven. Everybody else would either go to that old underworld or later on the idea of a separate hell. But different Jewish thinkers over the centuries philosophized about this. Some of them thought it was for special Jewish groups. Others thought, no, everybody can go there. Similar debates have happened and continue to happen within Christianity and Islam. Who goes to heaven? Is it just your particular religion, or can everybody go there? So the whole development of what Revelation is about comes out of this ferment of new thinking in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, when the Jews were being persecuted, and they tried to think of there must be something more than this. There must be some reward for all this persecution that we're having. So the idea of an afterlife or of the heavenly Jerusalem. So it's a different form of heaven. It's the idea that heaven is actually on earth. It comes out of that thinking.
Okay, so what we would expect post-apocalypse, according to the belief structures, is that heaven appears on earth.
According to the book of Revelation. Now, the book of Revelation is only one of many apocalypses that were written. The Greek word apocalypse simply means revelation. But it's the phrase apocalyptic literature is given to a whole host of documents that were written around the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st centuries BCE, which dealt with these themes of the end of the world and judgment and punishment, and whether people will be resurrected. The book of Revelation, so the last book of the Christian New Testament, talks about the heavenly Jerusalem. That is going back to what I was saying before, that there are many, many different ways that heaven has been depicted. This was just one way that it was depicted. There are lots of other documents, both contemporary with and later than the book of Revelation, that talk about different sorts of heaven. Both a heaven beyond the planetary bodies, whether it's a single heaven or maybe a whole series of heavens beyond the planetary bodies. So this is one of the reasons why I say, if you think heaven's boring, which heaven are you talking about? Are you talking about the heavenly Jerusalem? Are you talking about the single heaven beyond the planetary bodies? Are you talking about the 7 heavens and what's happening there? And there are lots of journeys that are written by early Christians describing their journeys to heaven, where sometimes they can see the planetary bodies, or sometimes they can just about see God. Maybe they won't be able to reach the 7th heaven, but they can see where it is.
This has been really deep, cool stuff. Piotr, I'd like to talk for just a second, give everybody some understanding of your book. Your book is called Where Airy Voices Lead. Where can people get that? It's
available, through all the usual places. It's available, for instance, on Amazon.
And do you have a website that people can go to get more information about you and any work you might have coming up?
Yes, I have a website, which is essentially my name. So it's piotrBienkowski.co.uk. So everything I've written there is on a separate tab with a brief description of what it is, and also the work that I'm doing and have done in the past.
And we'll include that link in the show notes. So if you didn't quite catch that, or you don't know how to spell that, which is not going to be surprising.
You won't be the first.
Excellent stuff, as always. This has been really cool. Kelle, anything you want to say to wrap up?
Well, so, here's the thing. when you start studying spirituality and you start walking down these paths, getting a historical perspective really makes all the difference. Because as Piotr referenced many times, there are multiple mythologies across multiple cultures that have similar themes. And when you can identify the themes, then you have archetypes and to work with in your spiritual practice and things that you can use to do esoteric practices within an established archetype. It's important to really understand the mythologies behind things and to understand how things have evolved through history, especially given the context that Piotr has been so lovely in providing in this episode of what historical context it was. If you don't understand the historical context in which things came into being, then you may not actually understand why they did what they did. And if you misconstrue it, then energetically, you're probably not going to be in alignment with what you're doing. So this is why studying history is important. And this is why I invited him onto the podcast, is because while it's a diversion from what we normally talk about, it's so intertwined with what we will ultimately do. So thank you so much for being on the call.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely to talk to you.
I'm thrilled that you could be here. Thank you. And I think that'll wrap it up for today.
It sure will. All right, folks, that is all that we have for this week. But be sure to join us next time as Kelle adds another chapter into your guide to energy, magic, and the spirit world. I'm Joey C., here with Kelle Sparta and Piotr Bienkowski, and you have been listening to Spirit Sherpa. So long, everyone.
Bye.
Each mile I travel over 13,000 now. I leave behind a little fear.
Spirit Sherpa is the sole property of Kelle Sparta Enterprises and is distributed under Creative Commons BY-NC-ND 4.0 license. For more information about this licensing, please go to creativecommons.org. Any requests for deviations to this licensing should be sent to KELLE@KELLESPARTA.com. That's Kelly@KelleSparta.com. To sign up or to get more information on the programs, offerings, and services referenced in this episode, please go to KelleSparta.com. This episode of Spirit Sherpa has been produced by Honu Voice Productions.
And my love and my life and me.